Hello, welcome to SuperReturn Asia. I'm Sarah Clarke, coming to you from the JW Marriott Hotel in Hong Kong. And I'm joined by Gavin Serkin, who's the Managing Editor and the author of Frontier Funds. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
The topic of conversation we want to have today is looking at the top 3 Asian markets of tomorrow. Which markets offer the best prospects and which potentially offer or suggest or could pose some landmines?
Okay, I like the way you phrase that question because, you know, it is all about weighing up the potential disasters against the potential reward. And, you know, people that really focus on these markets have a way of looking at it. You know, Jerome Booth, who's the co-founder of Ashmore, was one guy who was implemental to my book, and he looks at it as emerging markets where you're actually getting paid for the risk. Another guy I work quite closely with is Leapfrog Investments in impact investing, and their companies are they're turning over a revenue of above 40% because these are in high growth economies. And his way of looking at it is, well, the risk is surely bigger if you're in the developed world and you're in economies and companies that are growing in single digits. You've got a much bigger risk of realizing real losses. But, you know, to answer the question about the potential reward areas, these are usually countries that have the right demographics, so big population, young population, strong growth in terms of the workforce, and they've usually got some kind of momentum behind it. So it's often a political momentum coming out of civil war, like say Sri Lanka from almost 3 decades of civil war, or a political momentum coming out of communism, let's say, into something that's more of a capitalist kind of structure like we're seeing with Vietnam.
So what could we say in Asia? What are the top 3 that you believe are kind of the frontier or the next ones?
Okay, so I've mentioned 2 of them. You know, Sri Lanka, just because of the peace dividends that we should see coming through after this long civil war. You know, the politics means that it's quite tough getting there. You know, this is a government that hasn't made the steps of reform that had been wished for, and is still kind of tied up with a lot of allegations of corruption. It still ranks very low on Transparency International, but it's got a lot of investment coming in from China, and interestingly also India is trying to vie with China for some of that. For example, in Habantota Airport, which is a very small airport, and India is bidding for a stake. Myanmar, obviously very, very troubled right now with the Rohingya headlines that we're seeing, but again, China making huge investments. Actually, in Rakhine State, the most troubled state, has this huge, potentially huge offshore oil and gas industry that China is investing in, and parts of the One Belt One Road plan from China is to link Rakhine into mainland China. But the big one is Vietnam. Vietnam is out and out the favourite. You know, in my book, it was the number 2 after Nigeria, and that's because it's got those demographics. It's got a very young, energetic, resourceful population. It's got good education, and it's got huge investment from China right now. And trade is just. We hear about the diplomatic spat over the South China Sea all the time. Vietnam trying to warn China against incursions in the South China Sea. You might think that that's disrupting trade. It's not. You know, trade is going through the roof, and Chinese tourism is also going through the roof in Vietnam. Okay,
looking at Vietnam, then the industries and stocks and bonds that you consider in that market. I mean, what would those considerations be?
Well, it's funny because when you look from the outside in emerging markets and frontier markets, often you think it's all about resources, and you know, emerging market fortunes go up and down with the price of oil very often. But the investors who are specialists there are really looking to be as close to the consumer as they can. So it's fast-moving consumer goods. It's beer. You know, it's food. It's people having money in their pocket coming from subsistence existence, where you know they had enough just to barter for informally for some essentials, to now having some disposable income. It's banking. You know, one of the companies I work closely with is Exotics Capital, and you know they're very, very focused on banks because that's the sector where you know you obviously it's bank accounts being open, but it's everything that spins out from that, from financial inclusion, from people having insurance for the first time, and then there's mobile phones which are correlated to that as well. It's not just having the airtime time it's having the access to financial services, to other services that you can get, health services through your mobile phone.
Could some of these ASEAN nations, like the Philippines and Vietnam, collectively over time pose a kind of greater challenge for some of the other bigger players in this region?
I mean, there's limits to, we've seen the ASEAN region make great strides in terms of transport links, trade links, and one of the guys in my book, Dominic Scriven from Dragon Capital in Vietnam, he was likening the links that are going to be created through flights to what's happening in the European Union. If we think back to 20 years ago, how difficult it was to fly from one place into, say, Eastern Europe, and now it's just so much easier. And if you think about the islands in Southeast Asia, it's even more difficult to get around, and that's going to improve links and communication greatly. But politically, the ASEAN is still not as cohesive as you might think from the outside. So, the South China Sea, which we were just talking about, is a great example. You've got Vietnam pretty much on its own there, making the case against China, and the Philippines, Duterte, who's this 5-round president in so many other fields, is more or less silent on the topic of China in the South China Sea. So I don't think it's the right way to think about it as these nations challenging China. It's more what they get from China, and China needs the ASEAN as much as the ASEAN needs China. China's a population that's increasingly going to be aging. The headlines just yesterday here in Hong Kong were all about Vietnamese maids being able to come in for the first time to Hong Kong since the Vietnam War, and that's because there's a need for workers here.
Yeah. And another point which I found interesting, in your list of global emerging markets of tomorrow, you mentioned Nigeria at the top of the list. Could it one day, down the track, be the likes of rivaling some of the growth countries here?
Yeah, I mean, it has to, because you think about the demographic. Nigeria, by UN population projections, is going to overtake the USA as the third biggest country. It'll be number 1 India, number 2 China, number 3 Nigeria. Now, the economy has to grow to the level that the population is growing. Otherwise, we have a huge humanitarian disaster in the world. So geostrategically, Nigeria becomes more important. More resources are put into making sure that the right people are not running the country, it's a democracy, but having the right advice. We saw a taste of that before the last election in Nigeria, before Buhari's election, where there was a lot of American focus on the Boko Haram situation in the north of Nigeria and avoiding civil war. And you'll see more of that as we go forward, as it becomes more important as an economy, and the success of Nigeria becomes more important. So it's very difficult to see Nigeria's economy actually overtaking China. I think that would be a wild card to hold. But growth-wise, yes, Nigeria should overtake China in terms of growth.
Gavin Serkin, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah.
That's all we've got time for, but if you'd like to find more conversations like this, please look for our hashtag SRAsia. Thanks for joining us, and bye for now.